In the year 1228, a man sailed from the shores of southern Italy to lead a holy war for the most sacred city in Christendom, carrying with him a title so vast it seemed to encompass the entire Christian world. Yet, this man, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, had been formally declared a heretic, a blasphemer, and an enemy of God by the very Pope whose faith the war was meant to defend. He arrived in the Holy Land not with the blessing of the Church, but under its heaviest curse, and the Crusader knights who were supposed to follow him had been ordered by the Pope not to receive him. What happened next was so strange, so contrary to everything medieval history believed about holy war, that neither Christianity nor Islam knew what to do with it. He recovered Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, the prize for which a century of blood had been poured into desert sand without drawing a single sword. And for accomplishing this impossible thing, this excommunicated emperor was condemned by both sides. Welcome back, dear listeners, and welcome if this is your first time here. Make yourself comfortable, let the world outside grow quiet, and if you enjoy what we do here, a like and a subscription mean the world to us. What time is it where you are tonight, and where in the world are you watching from? And tell me, before we begin, do you believe it is possible to win a holy war without ever raising a sword? Chapter 1. The Wonder of the World. On the 26th of December in the year 1194, in the small Italian town of Jesse, a child was born in a tent set up in the middle of the market square. Outside, the winter air lay still and cold over the cobblestones. Inside, beneath the canvas, a dynasty was quietly beginning its most extraordinary chapter. The child's name was Frederick. His father was Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor and a member of the German Hohenstaufen line, a dynasty that had long ruled the lands north of the Alps. His mother was Constance of Sicily, daughter of the great King Roger II, and the last heir of the Norman Hauteville dynasty that had built a glittering kingdom in the warm Mediterranean south. The timing of Frederick's birth was not accidental in its significance. Just one day before, his father Henry had been crowned King of Sicily, uniting two of the most powerful political forces in medieval Europe under a single family. In one quiet moment, the German Empire of the North and the Norman Kingdom of the South had become one. For the papacy in Rome, this union was deeply unsettling. For generations, the popes had feared nothing more than being encircled, surrounded on all sides by Hohenstaufen power. Now, with a single child born in a tent in the market square of Jesse, that fear had taken form. The world into which Frederick arrived was already holding its breath, already watching, already uncertain of what this union of dynasties would bring. He had not yet opened his eyes, and the world had already begun to argue about him. Frederick's father, Henry VI, was a formidable man, driven, ambitious, and uncompromising in his pursuit of power. As Holy Roman Emperor, he had extended Hohenstaufen authority across vast stretches of Europe. His marriage in 1186 to Constance of Sicily had been a calculated alliance, one that gave the German dynasty a legitimate claim to the wealthy Norman kingdom of the south. And when Henry finally seized the Sicilian crown in 1194, the union of those two worlds became complete. But empires built on the ambitions of one man are fragile things. In September of 1197, while stationed in Messina on the eastern tip of Sicily, preparing for a crusade and putting down a local revolt, Henry VI contracted malaria. He died on the 28th of that month, leaving behind a kingdom in the south, an empire in the north, and a son not yet 3 years old. The consequences were immediate and chaotic. Without a capable adult ruler to hold the empire together, the German princes turned against one another. 2 rival claimants rose to contest the imperial throne. Otto IV of Brunswick, from the opposing Welf dynasty, and Philip of Swabia, Frederick's Hohenstaufen uncle. Civil war followed, pulling the empire's attention northward, away from the small child sitting quietly in Palermo. Frederick had inherited everything and controlled nothing. His father had built a world of extraordinary reach and ambition, and that world had collapsed into uncertainty before the boy could walk steadily across a room. He was, for the moment, simply an orphaned king, small, alone, and surrounded by forces larger than himself. With Henry gone, it fell to Constance of Sicily to protect her son. She was a woman of considerable resolve, the last surviving legitimate heir of the great Norman king Roger II, and she understood the dangers surrounding her child with clear-eyed precision. She moved quickly, establishing a council of regents to govern Sicily in Frederick's name, and she began to plan for the boy's future. But Constance herself did not have long. In late November of 1198, just 1 year after Henry's death, she too was gone, taken suddenly by illness on the 27th of that month. Frederick was not yet 4 years old. Before she died, Constance made a decision that would shape her son's childhood, and in ways she could not have foreseen, the rest of his life. She placed Frederick under the guardianship of Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful and capable men ever to occupy the papal throne. It was, on the surface, a surprising choice. The papacy and the Hohenstaufen dynasty had long been rivals. But Constance was a pragmatist. She needed a protector strong enough to hold the powerful Sicilian barons at bay, and she needed one who would not simply absorb her son's kingdom into his own ambitions. Innocent III accepted. He formally invested Frederick as King of Sicily, stood against the hostile Norman barons who threatened the child's claim, and became, in the absence of any other steady hand, the nearest thing to a guardian the young king would have. In practical terms, the Pope now held considerable influence over Sicilian affairs, an arrangement that would echo through Frederick's life long after his childhood had passed. The island of Sicily, in the late 12th century, was unlike anywhere else in the medieval world. It was a place where 3 great civilizations had not merely brushed against one another, but had genuinely woven themselves together: Arab, Byzantine Greek, and Norman Latin, creating something altogether new and difficult to name. The island's complex character was no accident of geography. It had been ruled in turn by ancient Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Byzantines before the Normans arrived. In the year 1061, a Norman warrior named Roger of Hauteville, younger brother of the formidable Robert Guiscard, began a slow conquest of the island from its Arab rulers. By 1091, the conquest was complete. But the Normans who settled Sicily did not erase what they found. Instead, they incorporated it. Muslim landowners were allowed to retain their properties. Arab officials continued to administer taxes and resolve disputes in Arabic. Islamic agricultural techniques, the irrigation systems, the cultivation of citrus, sugarcane, and saffron, were preserved and expanded. A land register known as the Diwan recorded grants and transactions in the Arabic language, and Muslim judges adjudicated property matters according to familiar custom. The Norman kings who followed, most magnificently Roger II, who proclaimed the Kingdom of Sicily in 1130, presided over this layered society with a pragmatism born of necessity and, it seems, genuine appreciation. Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians maintained their churches and their Byzantine liturgical traditions. Jewish communities observed their own religious courts. Latin Christians built cathedrals, and all of them, in some fashion, shared the sun-warmed streets of Palermo. Into this world, Frederick II was born and would grow. No building in Sicily revealed the kingdom's layered soul more completely than the Palazzo dei Normanni, the Palace of the Normans, at the heart of Palermo. It was a vast, sprawling complex of courtyards, halls, gardens, and chapels that seemed to embody every culture that had touched the island. At its centre stood the Palatine Chapel, begun by Roger II in the year 1132. To step inside was to stand within three civilizations at once. The sanctuary glowed with Byzantine-style gold mosaics depicting Christ and the Virgin, their solemn faces rendered in the tradition of Constantinople. The nave's vaulted ceiling was decorated with muqarnas, the honeycomb wooden ribbing of Islamic architecture, carved and inlaid with intricate arabesques of extraordinary delicacy. The marble floors were laid with geometric patterns borrowed from the Islamic world and figurative imagery drawn from the Western tradition. Around the palace, the city of Palermo continued this quiet conversation between cultures. The church of San Cataldo displayed Arabic-inspired arches and red domes that would not have looked out of place in a North African Medina. Legal documents were issued in Latin, Greek, and Arabic. Arab scribes worked alongside Latin clerics in the royal archives. Muslim artisans and engineers were employed in the great building projects of successive kings. In the streets, 5 languages moved through the air simultaneously: Latin, Greek, Arabic, Old Norman French, and the emerging Sicilian vernacular, a Romance dialect that had quietly absorbed something of each of the others. This was the world that surrounded Frederick during his earliest years. Not a world of clear borders and singular truths, but a world of layered beauty, of many voices speaking at once. Frederick grew up within this palace world as a ward, a child king without a stable protector, passed between regents who were more interested in the kingdom's resources than in the boy himself. The years of his minority, from 1198 onward, were marked by political fragmentation. The great barons of Sicily, sensing the absence of firm royal authority, reached outward and seized what they could: royal lands, offices, fiscal revenues, reducing the crown's real power to little more than the walls of Palermo. For the young Frederick, this meant a childhood of remarkable instability. At times, the material insecurity was acute enough that the boy sought shelter among the ordinary citizens of the city. He had no stable personal relationships beyond a small household of attendants. The regents appointed to care for him were largely self-serving. The council established by his mother, Constance, had dissolved into factional competition. And yet, And this is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Frederick's early years. The city of Palermo itself became his education. In its markets and mosques, its churches and gardens, its workshops and libraries, the young king moved freely among people of every background and faith. He listened to Arabic spoken in the streets. He heard Greek in the chapels. He absorbed the rhythms of a world that took plurality for granted. He was given access, too, to scholars, craftsmen, astrologers, and a royal menagerie of exotic animals. His earliest passions began to take shape in this unstructured, vivid environment. A love of reading, a fascination with the natural world, a particular obsession with birds of prey. The palace grounds of Palermo, with all their disorder, were shaping a mind of uncommon breadth. The education that Palermo gave Frederick was extraordinary, and nowhere was this more visible than in the languages he acquired. By the time he was 5, he was already fluent in Latin and the Sicilian vernacular. Around the age of 7, he began formal study of Greek, drawn from the Byzantine community that had never truly left the island. By 9, the Arabic spoken in the streets and among the island's Arab Christian community had become his own. By 12, he had added Provençal, the elegant tongue of the troubadour poets of southern France, completing a linguistic range that was, for a medieval child, almost without parallel. When Frederick was declared of legal age in 1208, at 14, he could speak 5 languages fluently: Greek, Arabic, Latin, Provençal, and Sicilian. In the years that followed, as his political responsibilities expanded northward into Germany and outward towards the wider world, he added Middle High German and Old French, completing a repertoire of 7 major medieval languages before he had fully grown into manhood. This was not mere accomplishment. It was transformation. Each language Frederick learned carried within it a different way of seeing, a different literature, a different philosophy, a different relationship to knowledge. Latin opened him to the Roman legal tradition and to the writings of the Church. Greek gave him access to the ancient philosophers and scientists in something closer to their original form. Arabic placed in his hands the greatest scientific and philosophical works of the Islamic world, the writings of Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Ghazali. He read these texts not as curiosities, but as living arguments about the nature of the world. And the world, for Frederick, was a subject of inexhaustible interest. Around Frederick, the court of Palermo drew remarkable minds from across the Mediterranean world. Scholars, poets, translators, and scientists gravitated towards the young king and the intellectual atmosphere of his court. Among them was Michael Scott, the Scottish polymath who served as a translator and brought to Frederick some of the great works of ancient Greek science, including Aristotle's natural philosophical treatises, rendered into Latin from Arabic intermediaries. There was the mathematician Leonardo Fibonacci of Pisa, whose work on numbers would leave a permanent mark on European mathematics. The Syrian philosopher Theodore of Antioch joined the court, as did the astronomer Guido Bonatti, the translator John of Palermo, and the physician John of Procida. This community of scholars gave Frederick access to the full range of ancient Greek science, the geometry of Euclid, the astronomical models of Ptolemy, the medical writings of Hippocrates and Galen, and the vast natural philosophy of Aristotle. These works arrived not directly from their Greek originals in most cases, but through the great translation networks that had grown across Sicily and Spain. Most notably, the Toledo school of translators, rendering Arabic and Greek learning into Latin for a new generation of readers. Frederick did not merely collect these texts. He engaged with them, debated them, questioned them, and in time tested them against his own observations. He was drawn from an early age to the natural world, to the behavior of animals, to the habits of birds, to the mechanics of living things. His fascination with falconry was not a courtly affectation, but a genuine scientific interest. In a world that largely accepted ancient authority without challenge, Frederick was learning to ask, but what do the things themselves show us? Even as Frederick's mind was being shaped by the great works of Greek and Arabic scholarship, the political world around him was moving rapidly. The chaos of his minority, the baronial seizures of royal land, the competing regents, the instability, was giving way to something more defined. Frederick was growing into a ruler, and the events unfolding across the Alps would soon demand that he act. The contest for the German imperial throne had dragged on for years. Philip of Swabia, Frederick's Hohenstaufen uncle, had battled Otto IV of Brunswick for supremacy. When Philip was assassinated in 1208, Otto briefly united the realm and was crowned emperor in 1209. But Otto proved dangerous in a way that even his allies had not anticipated. He moved aggressively into Italy, threatening the Papal States and, crucially, reaching toward the Kingdom of Sicily itself, the very realm Frederick held. Pope Innocent III, who had originally supported Otto, turned against him. He excommunicated the Welf emperor and withdrew papal backing. And into this opening, Frederick stepped. By 1212, he had gathered sufficient support among the German princes to be elected King of the Romans, and the tide began to turn. When Otto's armies suffered their catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, his authority collapsed. The German princes flocked to Frederick's banner. By 1220, Frederick II was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. The orphaned child of Jesse, the ward of Palermo's uncertain streets, had become the most powerful ruler in the Western world. And the education that the Palace of Palermo had given him was now his greatest instrument of rule. The legacy of Frederick's Sicilian childhood showed itself in the way he chose to rule. In Sicily, the kingdom he had grown up in, the one he knew most intimately, he built something genuinely new. He swept away the fragmented feudal system that had accumulated during his chaotic minority and replaced it with a centralized royal administration. Authority would flow from the crown, not from the hereditary lords. He created a bureaucracy of appointed royal officials, the giustizieri, who administered justice across clearly defined districts. The crown alone would collect revenues, enforce laws, and direct economic policy. State monopolies were established over the silk industry, salt production, and the minting of coinage. Customs duties on key imports were regulated from the centre. In 1231, Frederick promulgated the Liber Augustalis, the Constitutions of Melfi, a comprehensive legal code of 253 clauses, written in Latin and later translated into Greek, that established a uniform legal standard across the diverse peoples of his southern kingdom. Lombards, Greeks, Saracens, Germans, and Jews alike. Criminal and civil procedures were standardized. Private vengeance was prohibited. Physicians were required to complete practical apprenticeships before treating patients. It was, by the measure of any era, a remarkable document, and it remained the foundation of Sicilian law for 6 centuries. Around his court, Frederick gathered poets as eagerly as he gathered scholars. The Sicilian school of poetry that flourished around him, led by the notary Giacomo da Lentini, produced more than 300 poems in a refined Sicilian vernacular. Among their innovations was a small form that would change European literature entirely: the sonnet. Dante, Petrarch, and the whole tradition that followed them owed something to the court of Palermo. It was a contemporary chronicler named Riccardo di San Germano who first placed a phrase upon Frederick II that would outlast all the political struggles and dynastic rivalries of his era. He called him Stupor Mundi, wonder of the world. The phrase captured something real. Here was a man who had grown up in a palace of gold mosaics and Arabic arches, who had learned 7 languages before reaching manhood, who had read Avicenna and Averroes and Aristotle in the shadow of Norman towers, who had built laws that governed peoples of 3 faiths, and written poetry that would change European literature. His contemporaries found him admirable and alarming in roughly equal measure. His brilliance was undeniable. His willingness to engage with Islamic culture and scholarship, to conduct diplomatic correspondence in Arabic, to welcome Muslim scholars into his court, to debate philosophy with the Ayyubid rulers of Egypt, struck the papacy as deeply suspicious. Pope Gregory IX condemned his openness as evidence of unchristian tendencies. Frederick was excommunicated not once, but twice. And through all of it, he continued, unbothered, curious, and entirely himself. He had been shaped, after all, by a world that did not demand simplicity. Palermo had taught him that the same space could hold many truths at once, that a chapel ceiling could be decorated with Islamic muqarnas and Christian mosaics without contradiction, that a court document could be signed in 3 languages without confusion, that a mind could hold Aristotle and Al-Ghazali side by side without collapse. The wonder of the world had been made quietly and slowly in the layered streets of a sun-warmed island city. But the extraordinary world that shaped Frederick's mind was only the beginning of his story. For the real test of everything he had learned in the multicultural courts of Palermo lay waiting in the most contested city on earth. Chapter 2. The Crusade. He would not go on. On a summer day in 1215, in the ancient cathedral city of Aachen, a young king stood before an assembly of German princes and raised a cross above his head. Frederick II was 21 years old. He had only recently secured his place as king of the Romans, and the world around him was still settling into the shape his ambitions were slowly carving for it. The ceremony at Aachen had been designed to evoke something older and grander. The memory of Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor whose bones rested within those very cathedral walls. Frederick received the traditional imperial regalia, was anointed before the holy relics, and then, in a gesture that went beyond mere pageantry, he seized a cross and declared before all those gathered that he would lead a crusade to the Holy Land. The vow was not simply born of piety. It was a political commitment, carefully considered, made to secure the support of both the papacy and the German princes, whose loyalty he still needed. Pope Innocent III had guided Frederick's rise, had acted as a kind of protector to the young Sicilian king since his boyhood, and the crusading promise was woven into the very fabric of Frederick's imperial coronation. In exchange for that promise, Frederick received the legitimacy his reign required. Yet almost from the moment the words left his lips, the delays began. Germany was unsettled. Sicily was fractious. The empire he had inherited was a patchwork of competing loyalties and simmering rebellions. Frederick would spend the years that followed not sailing toward Jerusalem, but consolidating, always consolidating, the fragile world beneath his feet. The crusading vow Frederick had made at Aachen was not without its conditions. He had sworn that oath directly to Pope Innocent III, pledging to mount an expedition to recover Jerusalem, and he had agreed to keep his German imperial crown separate from his Sicilian kingdom. A concession designed to reassure the papacy that one man's dominion over both realms would not threaten the Church's own interests. The deadline originally given was June of 1225. That date lay a full decade in the future at the time of the vow, and yet even that generous span would prove insufficient, or so Frederick would claim. In Germany, the kingdom still trembled from the recent defeat of his rival, Otto IV. Guelph and Ghibelline factions clashed. His own son Henry, still a child then but already a figure of contention, would one day raise rebellion against him. In Sicily, noble families jostled for power, urban communities grew restless, and the tension between the island's remaining Muslim population and its Christian majority simmered quietly beneath the surface of daily life. Frederick portrayed each of these crises as urgent and impossible to abandon. The journey to the Holy Land, he insisted, could not begin while the foundation of his empire continued to crack beneath him. Pope Innocent III died in 1216, before the first deadline had even approached. His successor, Honorius III, was a different kind of man, more diplomatic, more patient, more willing to negotiate. Where Innocent had been a forceful overseer of Frederick's life, Honorius relied on encouragement and persuasion, on papal letters and gentle reminders, on the steady persistence of a churchman who believed, perhaps too charitably, that the emperor's delays were temporary. While Frederick delayed in Europe, the Crusader states in the Holy Land survived in a condition that could only be described as precarious. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, rebuilt with such effort after the Third Crusade, had been reduced to a thin coastal strip, centered on the port city of Acre. The inland territories, the castles, the fertile valleys, the roads that once carried pilgrims toward the Holy City remained largely in Muslim hands. The Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli still held, but they were islands of Latin power in a sea of Ayyubid strength, dependent on occasional reinforcements from the west to maintain even the illusion of security. Internally, the Latin lords of Outremer were divided and financially exhausted. Externally, the Ayyubid dynasty, descendants of the great Saladin, could muster armies vastly larger than anything the Crusader states could field. Truces came and went. The tension never truly lifted. This was the world that awaited Frederick's arrival, a world that had been waiting since 1215, watching the years pass, without the promised emperor appearing on the horizon. Into this waiting landscape, the Church launched the Fifth Crusade beginning in 1217, hoping that a great coordinated campaign in Egypt might finally break the Ayyubid grip on Jerusalem. Frederick was supposed to lead it. He was supposed to be the great imperial force that would anchor the expedition and give it the strength it needed. Instead, he remained in Europe, and the Fifth Crusade sailed without him, carrying the weight of a promise that had not yet been kept. The Fifth Crusade set its sights not on Jerusalem directly, but on Egypt, the strategic heart of Ayyubid power. If Egypt could be taken, the thinking went, Jerusalem would follow. In late May of 1218, a great fleet arrived near Damietta, a fortified port city at the mouth of the Nile. The siege that followed was long and difficult. The Crusaders constructed engines of war, blockaded the river, and attacked the city's massive fortified tower with special ships designed to carry scaling ladders and small fortress towers for hurling stones and javelins. The first assault failed. The ladders collapsed. The ships were driven back under heavy fire. But the Crusaders persisted, and after months of relentless pressure, Damietta fell in 1219. Among those who arrived at the Crusader camp during the siege was Francis of Assisi, the gentle friar who would later be named a saint. He came not to fight, but to speak with the Ayyubid Sultan himself, hoping to convert him. He was received by Sultan Al-Kamil with courtesy, listened to, and then sent back peacefully, having converted no one. The Sultan was a thoughtful man, and he was watching the campaign with clear eyes. Even before Damietta fell, Al-Kamil had begun making offers. He proposed returning the Kingdom of Jerusalem to Christian hands, retaining only a few key fortresses in exchange for the Crusaders withdrawing from Egypt and agreeing to a long-term truce. It was a remarkable offer. It was also refused. The papal legate Cardinal Pelagius, who had assumed effective command of the expedition, believed that total victory was still within reach. The army pressed on, and the war continued. Cardinal Pelagius was a man of deep conviction and limited military experience. He wielded both papal authority and significant financial resources, and he used both to claim supreme command over the crusading forces, overruling the military orders, overruling John of Brienne, the titular king of Jerusalem, and ultimately overruling common sense. When Al-Kamil renewed his offer of a negotiated peace, Pelagius refused again. He was convinced the recent arrival of fresh troops meant that Cairo itself could be taken. In July of 1221, the army marched southward toward the Egyptian capital. What met them was not glory, but catastrophe. The seasonal rise of the Nile, a phenomenon any experienced campaigner in Egypt would have anticipated, flooded the flat ground around the army, trapping the soldiers in waterlogged, disease-ridden terrain. Al-Kamil's forces closed around them. At Mansoura, the Crusaders were surrounded, unable to fight effectively and unable to retreat. The result was total defeat. The surviving army surrendered. Damietta, the great prize of the campaign, was handed back to the Ayyubids. The Crusaders were expelled from Egypt under an 8-year truce, with nothing to show for years of effort, sacrifice, and suffering. The failure was devastating to Western prestige, to the morale of the Crusader states, and to the reputation of all who had led the campaign. And through all of it, Frederick II had remained in Europe. His absence had not caused the disaster alone, but it had shaped it. The expedition had sailed without its promised anchor, and it had sunk accordingly. The failure of the Fifth Crusade made the need for a new expedition more urgent than ever. The papacy turned its eyes back toward Frederick II, and Frederick, now older, now holding the title of Holy Roman Emperor after his formal coronation in 1220, and now very aware of the political consequences of further delay, finally began to engage more seriously with his obligations. In 1223, he met with Pope Honorius III at Ferentino, and there an arrangement was made that tied the crusade to something far more personal. Frederick agreed to marry Isabella, also known as Yolande, the daughter of John of Brienne, the King of Jerusalem. The marriage was designed as a guarantee. It would bind the imperial house of Hohenstaufen to the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, ensuring that Frederick had both a personal stake in the Holy Land and a formal title that would give him the authority to act there. Frederick also pledged to launch his crusade by the feast of St. John the Baptist on June 24th, 1225. 2 years later, in July of 1225, a further agreement was formalized at the Council of San Germano. A treaty was signed between Frederick and Honorius, resetting the departure deadline to August 15th, 1227. The terms were precise and severe. Frederick was to lead the expedition personally, remain in the Levant for 2 years, and provide substantial financial support to the crusading cause. And if he failed to depart, if he broke this commitment as he had broken the others, he would face automatic excommunication. The Church had run out of patience. The treaty was a final warning dressed in diplomatic language. The marriage of Frederick II and Yolande of Jerusalem took place in November of 1225. Yolande, also known as Isabella II, was the only surviving daughter of John of Brienne and Marie of Montferrat. She had been born in 1212, making her approximately 13 years old at the time of the ceremony. The union was sealed by proxy in Acre and then solemnized in Brindisi Cathedral on the 9th of November. The arrangement had been negotiated carefully. John of Brienne had agreed to the match on the condition that Frederick would not claim the Jerusalem throne while John himself still lived. Because Yolande was the reigning queen of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, her marriage to Frederick immediately conferred upon him the title of King of Jerusalem by right of his wife. The day after the wedding, Frederick proclaimed himself king, not merely consort, but king. He demanded that the barons who had escorted Yolande to Italy swear their fealty to him directly. The agreement with John of Brienne was shattered before the ink of the marriage register had fully dried. The local nobility of Outremer, proud, independent, deeply suspicious of imperial authority, took note. The tension that followed Yolande to Italy would eventually cross the sea with her husband. Yolande herself would not live long enough to see Jerusalem. She died in 1228, giving birth to their son Conrad, the child who would inherit the Hohenstaufen claims to Jerusalem, Sicily, and the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick was now a widower and, by the strictest legal interpretation, a king of Jerusalem only through a son who was still an infant. Pope Honorius III died in March of 1227. The man who replaced him was of an entirely different character. Ugolino di Conti, who took the name Gregory IX, had been born around 1145 into a distinguished Italian noble family, a cousin of the great Innocent III himself. He had studied at the University of Paris, risen through the Church's legal and administrative structures, been made a cardinal by Innocent III, and served as Cardinal Bishop of Ostia before his election on the 19th of March, 1227. Gregory was a man of intellectual force, of genuine piety, and of an iron will that would not bend to political pressure. He had approved the Dominican and Franciscan orders. He would later institute the Papal Inquisition. He was a close friend to Francis of Assisi and to Dominic de Guzman. He was also deeply suspicious of Frederick II, distrustful of the emperor's ambitions in Sicily and Germany, and utterly determined that the crusading vow would be honored. The warm diplomatic patience of Honorius III was gone. In its place stood a man who viewed Frederick's delays not as political inconveniences, but as moral failures, as evidence of a ruler who had placed his own interests above God, above the Church, and above the suffering Christians of the Holy Land. The deadline in the Treaty of San Germano held. Frederick was to depart by the 15th of August, 1227. Gregory IX intended to hold him to every word of it. In the summer of 1227, Frederick II finally moved towards the sea. At Brindisi, on the heel of the Italian peninsula, an army assembled in the stifling heat of late summer. Soldiers and knights, servants and sailors gathered in crowded conditions beneath a sun that offered no mercy. But something terrible moved through the camp alongside the army. A severe epidemic swept the gathered forces, most likely the swamp fever known as malaria, thriving in the heat and the close quarters of the port. Men fell ill in vast numbers. Senior commanders were struck down. The Landgrave of Thuringia, one of Frederick's most important allies in the enterprise, died from the sickness. Frederick himself was incapacitated, reduced by the fever to a condition so serious that those around him feared for his life. The fleet that had been assembled to carry the crusade eastward could not sail with its emperor barely able to stand. Frederick turned back. On the 12th of September, he disembarked at Otranto, carried as much as walking, the grand departure of the Sixth Crusade collapsing before it had properly begun. Within 10 days, Pope Gregory IX responded. The terms of the Treaty of San Germano had been explicit. Failure to depart would bring automatic excommunication. Gregory did not hesitate. On the 29th of September 1227, the papal ban descended upon Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, King of Jerusalem, a spiritual sentence that cut him formally from the communion of the Church and cast him into a condition of religious exile from which no ordinary king could easily recover. Excommunication in the medieval world was not merely a spiritual matter. It was, in the fullest sense, a declaration of exile, not from a country, but from the entire community of Christian civilization. The excommunicated person was barred from the sacraments, forbidden to receive the Eucharist, refused a Christian burial should they die. They became, in the eyes of church law, a kind of non-person, spiritually severed from the body of believers. For a ruler, the consequences reached further still. Excommunication could release vassals from their oaths of loyalty. It gave nobles a religiously sanctioned reason to rebel. The Pope could couple the ban with an interdict, a suspension of religious services across a ruler's entire territory, depriving ordinary people of mass, of marriage rites, of burial, and turning the population against the Lord, whose stubbornness had brought divine punishment upon them all. Gregory IX did not stop at the excommunication itself. He publicly denounced Frederick in the Basilica of St. Peter, calling him a wicked and unfaithful tyrant, a perjurer, and a scourge of the Church. He declared that Frederick's armies should be barred from the Holy Land, that his enterprise was not a true crusade, but a corruption of one. He urged Christian princes to regard the emperor as an enemy of the faith. He summoned councils to confirm the condemnation. Frederick, for his part, responded with letters of his own, dispatched to the kings of Europe, accusing the papacy of overreach and political manipulation, insisting that his illness had been genuine and his determination to fulfill his vow undiminished. The war of words was fierce, but it was fought between two men who understood that something larger than words would soon be required. Yet Frederick II did not retreat into silence. He did not beg for absolution or surrender his ambitions to the papal condemnation. Instead, he made public his intention to proceed, to sail for the Holy Land regardless of the excommunication that now hung over his name like a stone. His reasoning was not simply defiance, it was calculation. Frederick had been in correspondence with Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt for some years. He was aware that Al-Kamil, the same thoughtful ruler who had offered to surrender Jerusalem during the Fifth Crusade, remained open to negotiation. Frederick knew that a diplomatic approach, a modest military presence combined with the revival of earlier offers, might succeed where the armies of the Fifth Crusade had failed through obstinacy and overreach. He also understood the political stakes at home. To delay further was to risk his empire. His vassals needed to see him act. His title as King of Jerusalem, already legally complicated by Yolande's death in 1228, since the throne had technically passed to their infant son Conrad, still gave him a claim worth pursuing. There was something deeply unusual in what Frederick was preparing to do. An excommunicated emperor sailing under a papal curse toward a holy war that the Pope had declared him unfit to lead, carrying a plan rooted not in battle but in conversation. The Knights of the Holy Land had been ordered to bar his entry. The Church had declared his mission invalid, and still he turned toward the sea. With the papal curse upon his name and the Knights of the Holy Land ordered to bar his entry, Frederick II set his sails eastward toward a city that had cost the medieval world a century of blood, carrying a plan so unlike any crusade before it that even his own men could not understand what they were sailing into. Chapter 3: The Sultan and the Emperor. Somewhere between the desert and the sea, two worlds were moving slowly toward one another. Not with armies, not with the crash of iron and the smoke of burning cities, but with letters carried by patient envoys across long, dusty roads. It was the year 1228, and the story of what would happen next begins not with a battle, but with a man. His name was Al-Malik Al-Kamil Nasir ad-Din Muhammad. He was born sometime between 1177 and 1180, a member of the Ayyubid dynasty, the great Kurdish Sunni ruling house that had shaped the fate of the Islamic world for nearly half a century. He was the son of Al-Adil, who was himself the brother of the legendary Saladin. That lineage placed Al-Kamil at the very heart of one of history's most storied families. When Saladin died, his empire, stretching across Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, passed to his sons and brothers. In time, Al-Kamil inherited his father's throne, becoming the fourth Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt in 1218. He ruled a realm vast in name, though deeply complicated in practice. Egypt was his stronghold. Syria and Palestine were divided among cousins and brothers, each governing their own territories with considerable independence, each watching the others with careful eyes. Al-Kamil was not simply a military ruler. Contemporary chroniclers described a man of cultivated mind, a sultan who sought the company of scholars who enjoyed philosophical debate, who was recorded as being always interested in scholarship and learning beyond the military challenges of his age. He carried within him the inheritance of Saladin's political tradition, pragmatic, flexible, and acutely aware that survival in a fractured world required more than armies. It required patience. It required conversation. And in 1228, conversation was exactly what was needed. To understand Al-Kamil in 1228, one must first understand the world he had inherited and the tensions that lived within it. When their father Al-Adil died in 1218, the Ayyubid realm was divided among his surviving sons. Al-Kamil received Egypt. His brother Al-Muazzam Isa was given Palestine and Transjordan. His brother Al-Ashraf Musa took Syria and the territories of the Jazira to the north. On the surface, the division seemed manageable. In practice, it was the beginning of a long and quiet friction. Al-Kamil and Al-Muazzam soon found themselves in contest over the Syrian heartland, particularly Damascus. Their rivalry deepened during the years of the Fifth Crusade, when the Christian armies had pressed hard into Egypt and the brothers had been forced into uneasy coordination. That crusade had drained resources and left wounds in both the land and the family's unity. When Al-Muazzam died in 1227, his son An-Nasir Dawood inherited his father's position, but Al-Kamil moved quickly, confining his nephew to Transjordan while securing Palestine for himself. The family's fault lines were now unmistakable. Al-Kamil held Egypt and Palestine. Al-Ashraf held the north. And between them, younger relatives watched and waited. This was the political landscape into which the Sixth Crusade was now descending. A new enemy from the west was approaching, and yet the Sultan's gaze was divided, pulled between the Crusader armies gathering at the coast and the rivals gathering within his own dynasty. The politics of family and faith were tangled together, as they so often were in this ancient, complicated world. And in the middle of it all, Al-Kamil was already thinking carefully about how to navigate what was coming. The first thread connecting Al-Kamil to the man who would become his counterpart was drawn years before the Sixth Crusade began. It was a thread made not of iron or necessity, but of something more unusual: curiosity. Toward the end of 1220, while the Fifth Crusade was still pressing into Egyptian territory, Al-Kamil sent a formal embassy westward. The message was carried by a Frankish messenger to the court of a young Holy Roman Emperor named Frederick II. The Sultan was extending an offer of peace and dialogue, inviting Frederick to send his own representatives in return. This initial outreach did not immediately bear its full fruit, but it opened a correspondence that would quietly deepen over the following years. Between 1221 and 1228, letters passed between the two courts through a succession of envoys. But these were not merely political dispatches. Frederick, a man of exceptional intellectual curiosity himself, forwarded philosophical, geometric, and arithmetic questions to Al-Kamil's court. The Sultan, in turn, passed the most challenging of these to his leading scholars. Among them, the eminent mathematician and philosopher Sheikh Alam al-Din Qaisar, and consulted circles of learned men before crafting replies. The questions touched on matters deep and ancient, whether the world was eternal or created, the nature of the soul, the boundaries between mathematics and metaphysics. These were the kinds of questions asked not by men preparing for war, but by men genuinely drawn toward understanding. By 1227, the correspondence had shifted in tone. Frederick wrote to Al-Kamil proposing that the Sultan grant him the capital of the land, Jerusalem, and the right to visit its holy sites, arguing that such a concession would display the Sultan's wisdom to all Western rulers. The diplomatic groundwork was being laid, slowly, patiently, in the manner of two men who seemed, in some quiet way, to recognize something of themselves in the other. Among the envoys who moved between these two courts, one figure stands apart with particular clarity. His name was Fakhr al-Din ibn al-Sheikh, an Egyptian emir of the Ayyubid dynasty, born before 1211, and Al-Kamil's most trusted diplomat in dealings with the Western emperor. Fakhr al-Din had been dispatched to Frederick's court in Sicily on two occasions, in 1226 and again in 1227. He carried with him Al-Kamil's proposals, an offer to return Jerusalem, a suggestion of a joint alliance against shared threats, and the measured language of a sultan who wanted peace without humiliation. Frederick received him warmly, so warmly in fact that he made the Muslim emir a knight, a gesture remarkable in its intimacy and symbolic weight. Fakhr al-Din was more than a messenger. He was a cultural bridge, a man who could move between the courts of Islam and Christendom with the kind of ease that comes only from genuine intelligence and long practice. He understood how to frame arguments, how to read a room, how to convey not just words, but intentions. On Frederick's side, the Arabic-speaking courtiers and translators who accompanied his missions served the same essential function. They rendered Arabic texts into Latin, carried the emperor's meaning across languages, and shaped the tone of negotiations in ways that could not always be preserved in the written record. Without these intermediaries, patient, skilled, culturally fluent, the dialogue between Al-Kamil and Frederick could never have been possible. The great diplomatic achievement that was coming depended not only on the willingness of two powerful men, but on the quiet work of those who stood between them, turning words into understanding across the long distance of language and faith. When Frederick II finally sailed for the Holy Land, he arrived at Acre on the 7th of September, 1228. The world he stepped into was not the unified Crusader kingdom of legend. It was something far more fragile. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been reduced over the long years of war to a narrow string of coastal cities and scattered inland lordships. Its political life turned around great noble families: the Ibelins, the Montforts, the Briennes, the Lusignans, each holding their remaining fiefs with fierce pride and fierce suspicion of outside interference. The kingdom was nominally Frederick's, through his marriage to the late Queen Isabella II, whose infant son Conrad he had placed on the throne with himself as regent. But that claim was bitterly contested. The Patriarch of Jerusalem in 1228 was Gerald of Lausanne, and he had received explicit orders from Pope Gregory IX. Frederick was excommunicated and was to be denied the kiss of peace, refused all ecclesiastical honours, and treated as a man outside the church. The Patriarch followed these instructions with determination, threatening to place the city under interdict should Frederick dare to enter it. The military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, regarded Frederick with a particular wariness. Both orders had declined to serve under an excommunicated emperor, seeing his goals as contrary to their religious mission and the interests of the Latin kingdom. Instead of marching with his army, they kept their forces a full day's march behind him, maintaining a deliberate and symbolic distance. Frederick found himself in a land that was technically his, surrounded by men who did not trust him, backed by the church's condemnation, and facing a negotiation that no one else had been willing or able to attempt. And yet Frederick pressed forward. From Acre he dispatched his embassy southward, toward the Ayyubid Sultan's encampment. His envoys, Thomas of Aquino and Balian of Sidon, travelled first to Nablus, where Al-Kamil's representatives waited, and later to the Sultan's camp at Tol al-Ajul as the negotiations shifted ground. Al-Kamil, in turn, sent his envoys northward, and the two sides began to meet at the Hospitaller camp at Rekodani near Acre. The negotiations were conducted entirely through these intermediaries. Frederick and Al-Kamil never met face to face. Their dialogue was carried by envoys who moved between the camps, bringing proposals, carrying replies, softening language, and bridging the gaps of mistrust that inevitably arose between parties whose interests were so different. Al-Kamil had his own reasons to negotiate. The internal pressures on him in 1228 were considerable. His rivalry with his brothers and nephews over the divided Ayyubid territories had left him exposed. Another costly war against a well-armed Crusader force, and Frederick had brought approximately 10,000 infantry and 2,000 knights, risked overwhelming a realm already stretched by the campaigns of the previous decade. The Fifth Crusade had drained resources. The division of the Ayyubid family had weakened coordination. A fresh invasion threatened to exploit every vulnerability at once. By negotiating, by offering Jerusalem as a diplomatic token, Al-Kamil could avoid the war, preserve his hold on Egypt and Syria, and buy the time he needed to consolidate power against his family rivals. The city's walls had already been demolished by his late brother Al-Muazzam. Jerusalem was practically indefensible. Ceding it cost less in Al-Kamil's careful calculation than defending it. The talks did not flow smoothly. At several points, the negotiations teetered at the edge of collapse. The goals of the two sides were genuinely different, and the mistrust between them ran deep. Frederick needed a result, something he could present to Christendom as a triumph. Al-Kamil needed to concede as little as possible while securing the peace that protected his realm. Around both of them, hostile voices urged harder positions. The Templars and Hospitallers kept their distance but watched with suspicion. Al-Kamil's own court was divided. Religious scholars and military commanders urged the Sultan not to give ground on the holy city. But the envoys kept moving between the camps. The scholarly exchange that had been built up over years of correspondence, the philosophical letters, the mathematical questions, the careful courtesies, had created a layer of goodwill beneath the politics. It was not friendship, exactly, but it was a kind of mutual respect, a recognition between two men who had never met that the other was a serious, thoughtful, rational partner. Al-Kamil explained to his advisors that the concession of Jerusalem would not represent a true loss to Islam. The most sacred Muslim sites, the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the surrounding shrines of the Haram al-Sharif, would remain under Muslim control with a Muslim garrison and a Muslim Qadi overseeing them. Only the ruined churches and the shell of the old Christian quarter would pass to the Crusaders. And since the walls were already gone, the city could not be fortified against any future recovery. It was a temporary arrangement, he argued, not a permanent surrender. Whether his advisors were convinced is another matter. But the negotiations continued slowly and carefully through the long weeks of autumn and into winter. On the 11th of February, 1229, the delegations completed a draft of the agreement. 7 days later, on the 18th of February, the two sovereigns formally accepted the final terms. The Treaty of Jaffa had been made. What it contained was remarkable by any measure. Jerusalem would be returned to Christian control, its holy sites, its streets, its long contested name. Bethlehem and Nazareth would follow. The coastal city of Jaffa, along with Acre, Sidon, and the ruined castle of Toron, were confirmed in Christian hands. A narrow corridor running from the coast inward would grant the Crusaders a supply route to the sea. Portions of Galilee were also included, and the towns of Ramla and Lydda would be divided between the two sides. But the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, remained entirely under Muslim authority. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock stayed in Muslim hands, administered by a Muslim garrison and overseen by a Muslim Qadi. Christian and Muslim pilgrims alike would be permitted to visit the holy city, though Christians were not to bear arms within it. Muslims living in or near Jerusalem were guaranteed their homes, their possessions, and the free practice of their faith. No new fortifications were to be built on the holy sites. The city's defensive walls, already demolished, would not be rebuilt. Jerusalem would be open, unwalled, held by something more fragile than stone. Held by an agreement between two men who had never stood in the same room, whose worlds had been at war for a century, and who had nevertheless found a way, through patient diplomacy, to do what no army had managed. The truce was set to last for 10 years, 5 months, and 40 days, beginning on the 24th of February. When Frederick entered Jerusalem, he found a city unlike any he might have imagined from the illuminated manuscripts and crusading sermons of his youth. Its walls were gone, its streets were quiet. The great sacred structures of the Haram al-Sharif rose above the city in the morning light, domed and magnificent, belonging now, as the treaty required, to neither his authority nor his religion. The Patriarch of Jerusalem had done as instructed. He placed the city under interdict, halting all priestly services, and dispatched Archbishop Peter of Caesarea to meet the imperial forces, though the envoy arrived too late to effect anything. The churches of Jerusalem fell silent. No Mass was celebrated. No bells rang. Frederick proceeded to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre nonetheless, and there, with no bishop to crown him and no clergy to preside, he took the crown from the altar and placed it upon his own head. It was a gesture characteristic of the man, defiant, theatrical, and deeply alienating to those who believed that sacred authority could not simply be appropriated by will. The Templars and Hospitallers watched from a distance. The local Crusader nobility received the news with cold anger. They saw the treaty not as a triumph, but as a humiliation. A private arrangement concluded without the High Court's consent, without the blessing of the Church, and without a single battle fought. The emperor had obtained what armies had spent a century dying to recover, and he had done it through conversation with an enemy they regarded with absolute contempt. It was a peace that had no celebration, and yet it was a peace, the first quiet, fragile peace that Jerusalem had known in a very long time. Across the distance of envoys and sealed letters, Al-Kamil received word of what had been accomplished. And then, from across his world came the reaction he had perhaps anticipated, but perhaps had not fully prepared himself to receive. The Muslim world was not quiet. Islamic chronicles record that the news of Jerusalem's surrender struck like a wound. The ruler of Damascus, An-Nasir Dawood, Al-Kamil's own nephew, demanded a public sermon in the great mosque condemning the indignities that had been suffered. Chroniclers such as Sibt ibn al-Jawzi recorded the grief and outrage that spread through Muslim cities, the sense that something irreplaceable had been given away. Al-Kamil was accused of underestimating Jerusalem's religious and symbolic importance. He was said to have treated the holy city as a political token, when it was, in the hearts of his people, something far more than that. Some Muslim writers labeled the treaty one of the most disastrous events of Islam, even while others acknowledged that Al-Kamil's reasoning was pragmatic and that the Haram al-Sharif had been preserved. And yet the Sultan had also been praised in other quarters for other things. Islamic sources portray him as fair toward Coptic Christians, granting them legal freedoms and adjudicating their disputes justly. His openness to dialogue, his willingness to receive the scholar St. Francis years before, to debate philosophy across the cultural divide, to correspond with an excommunicated emperor as though ideas mattered as much as armies, marked him as a ruler of unusual character in an unusually difficult age. He was a man who had made a decision that history would argue over for centuries. Whether it was wisdom or surrender depended entirely on where one stood and in what century one happened to be living. And so two men had shaped the fate of a city without ever meeting. Al-Kamil, Sultan of Egypt, nephew of Saladin, inheritor of a fractured dynasty, a ruler who loved scholarship and wielded diplomacy with the same precision others reserved for swords, had surrendered Jerusalem without a siege and preserved the Haram al-Sharif without a battle. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, excommunicated, brilliant, distrusted by his own side, had recovered the holiest city in Christendom without a drop of blood, and had been punished for it with silence where there should have been celebration. Between them, patient envoys had carried words across a landscape scarred by a century of war. Fakhr al-Din had moved between courts, translating not just language, but intention. Scholars had answered philosophical questions sent from one civilization to another. Gifts had been exchanged, camels, silks, precious goods, as though beneath all the theology and the politics, two curious, complicated minds had found something worth acknowledging in each other. The city of Jerusalem stood now in a strange and unfamiliar quiet. Its walls were gone. Its churches were silent, under interdict. The dome of the rock gleamed in the winter light, untouched as the treaty required. Pilgrims of both faiths were promised safe passage, and the world that surrounded all of this, the Crusader nobility, the military orders, the Islamic scholars, the faithful of two religions, looked upon what had been done and did not know how to feel. The treaty was signed, Jerusalem had been returned to Christendom without a drop of blood, and now the world that had spent a century fighting over this city would have to decide what it made of a peace that neither side had asked for, and neither side knew how to accept. Chapter 4. A Crown Without a Blessing. On the 17th of March, in the year 1229, Frederick II entered the ancient city of Jerusalem. He walked through streets worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims, beneath a sky that held no particular ceremony, no grand procession, no papal blessing to consecrate the moment. He had taken Jerusalem not by the sword, but by negotiation, by long letters exchanged across desert roads, by patient diplomacy conducted between an excommunicated emperor and an embattled sultan. And yet here he was, standing at last within the walls of the city that had drawn crusaders from across Europe for more than a century. The morning light would have fallen gently over the old stones, over the domes and archways, over the narrow lanes still holding the breath of 1,000 years of prayer. Frederick moved quietly through all of it, making his way toward the place that had always stood at the center of everything, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where tradition held that Christ himself had been laid to rest and had risen again. It was the heart of Jerusalem, the reason the city had been fought over and mourned over and dreamed of by so many for so long. And it was there in that sacred and silent space that Frederick intended to make his claim permanent, not through a coronation ordained by Rome, not through the hands of a patriarch, but through an act entirely his own. The city waited around him, uncertain and watchful. Something had already shifted in the air, something that could not quite be named. A crown was coming, but no blessing would accompany it. Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in the stillness that only very old and very sacred places seem to hold, Frederick paused before the tomb. Then, in a gesture that would be debated and condemned and marveled at for centuries, he lifted a golden crown from the altar, a crown that had been prepared for a Jerusalem coronation, and placed it upon his own head. There was no patriarch present to perform the rite. There was no papal legate to read the sacred words. Frederick crowned himself sovereign of Jerusalem by his own hand in the holiest church in Christendom. The act was deliberate. It was also, by the standards of his time, almost incomprehensible. Medieval coronations were sacred ceremonies. They were the moment when the church affirmed that a ruler's power came ultimately from God. To remove that moment of ecclesiastical affirmation, to perform it alone, was to make a statement that unsettled the foundations of how kingship itself was understood. Frederick's address, as recorded in surviving chronicles, was solemn and formal. He invoked the legacy of Rome. He pledged to uphold justice, to protect the church, to preserve peace across the realm. His words linked his rule to the ancient tradition of the Roman imperial monarch as both secular ruler and guardian of the Christian order. And yet the very manner in which those words were spoken, without a blessing from above, without a priest's hands, gave them a quality that no amount of eloquence could entirely smooth away. A king had crowned himself in Jerusalem. The city was Christian again, and the silence that followed held something between wonder and unease. The Crusader nobility of the Holy Land received the news of the self-coronation with something that moved well beyond disapproval. Among the barons and lords who had spent their lives governing this fragile kingdom at the edge of the known Christian world, Frederick's act was not simply unconventional. It was, in their understanding, illegal. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had its own constitution, its own high court, and its own deeply held customs regarding how treaties were made and how royal succession was affirmed. Frederick had bypassed all of it. His legal claim to the title rested on his marriage to Isabella II, the legitimate heiress of the kingdom, which gave him a hereditary right to the crown. But the manner of the coronation, unilateral, unconsecrated, performed without the approval of the kingdom's own governing institutions, was viewed as a violation of everything the Crusader barons held to be the proper order of things. Demands for homage were met with reluctance or outright refusal. The great military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, stood apart from the emperor with a coldness that bordered on open contempt. They had already condemned the treaty itself on multiple grounds, arguing it violated their religious and military purpose by aligning with Muslim powers they had taken vows to oppose. Now the spectacle of a self-crowned, excommunicated emperor demanding their loyalty in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was more than most of them could accept in silence. Jerusalem had been returned, and yet those who had spent their lives defending it seemed unwilling to celebrate. The air within the city's walls remained thick with a tension that no treaty and no crown had managed to dispel. The Knights Templars' opposition to Frederick and his treaty was among the most vocal and consequential of all the reactions that followed the coronation. Their condemnation of the agreement rested on specific and deeply felt grounds. They argued that the treaty aligned Christian power with Egypt, a Muslim realm, rather than with Damascus, which had at times been a Christian ally against Egypt, and that such an arrangement violated the very purpose for which the military orders existed. They were sworn to oppose Muslim power, not to make peace with it. Beyond the religious arguments lay something more personal. Frederick had, in the weeks following the treaty, publicly accused the Templars of plotting against him, of conspiring in the most extreme version of the charge to have him killed. Contemporary chronicles record these accusations, though no concrete evidence of an actual assassination attempt survives. Modern scholars regard the charges as political, shaped by propaganda rather than fact. But in the charged atmosphere of early 1229, they deepened the mutual suspicion between the emperor and the order into something approaching open hostility. In the days after the coronation, the Templars moved to put the treaty's practical terms into effect, reinforcing frontier castles, redeploying troops along pilgrim routes, and sending detailed reports back to their commanderies in Europe. They did what the agreement required of them, but they did it with the cold efficiency of men who believed they were serving the interests of the kingdom, despite the emperor, not because of him. Between Frederick and the Templars, there was no trust remaining. Only the fragile obligation of men bound to the same fractured enterprise, watching each other across a silence that neither was willing to break. While the Crusader lords and the military orders wrestled with the implications of the coronation, a different kind of storm was gathering in the cities of the Islamic world. In Cairo, in Damascus, in Baghdad, scholars and preachers and jurists raised their voices in condemnation, not of Frederick, but of the man who had handed Jerusalem to him. Al-Kamil, Sultan of Egypt, had given away Al-Quds. He had surrendered the third holiest city of Islam. In the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, the preacher Sibt ibn al-Jawzi was summoned to deliver a sermon before a congregation already raw with grief. His words described the loss of Jerusalem as a calamity, a betrayal of the Ayyubid legacy, a wound that would not easily heal. In Cairo, the senior scholars of Al-Azhar and the leading jurists of the city published declarations condemning the treaty as a religious violation. In Baghdad, the ulama echoed the same outrage, warning that the cession of sacred land would inflame the entire caliphate. The theological arguments ran deep. The Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, was not simply a piece of contested territory. It was the site from which the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven on the night journey, the first direction of Muslim prayer, one of the three holiest places on earth. Islamic scholars argued that its guardianship was a divine trust, a binding obligation established at the moment of the 7th century conquest, and incapable of being surrendered to another faith. Al-Kamil had not simply made a political compromise. In the eyes of many of his own people, he had broken something sacred. The political damage the treaty inflicted upon Al-Kamil within his own court was not merely the murmuring of distant scholars and preachers. It was immediate, and it was real. Dissent spread among his officials and advisors. Accusations of betrayal, of surrendering the holy city, of dishonoring the Ayyubid legacy, circulated through the corridors of the Cairo citadel and beyond. In the broader Ayyubid world, the dynamics among Al-Kamil's brothers and rivals shifted. The Ayyubid realm had long been a complicated arrangement of competing princes who nominally acknowledged Al-Kamil's seniority while guarding their own autonomy carefully. Al-Kamil had navigated those tensions for years, particularly the rivalry with his brother Al-Muazzam, which had only ended with Al-Muazzam's death in 1227. Now, with the treaty signed and the condemnations ringing from every pulpit, other Ayyubid princes found new reasons to question the Sultan's judgment. They had accepted the agreement, but acceptance was not the same as approval. The treaty that had been meant to secure Egypt's position by removing the Crusader threat had instead created a political vulnerability Al-Kamil had not entirely anticipated. He had sacrificed Jerusalem for stability, and the stability had proven far more uncertain than the sacrifice. Within his own court, those who had counseled against the agreement now found themselves with arguments that history seemed to be confirming. Al-Kamil remained in power, but the silence around him had changed. Some who had once spoken freely in his presence now chose their words more carefully, and the distance between the Sultan and certain members of his inner circle had grown in ways that no diplomatic triumph could entirely repair. Meanwhile, within the walls of Jerusalem itself, the Christian population found themselves living inside a city that had become, in a spiritual sense, almost impossible to inhabit. The Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, appalled by the treaty and its unauthorized nature, had placed the city under interdict, an ecclesiastical censure that suspended the celebration of the liturgy and the administration of nearly all the sacraments throughout the territory. Mass could not be said, church bells could not ring. Baptisms, marriages, and Christian burials within the city were forbidden. The faithful who had celebrated the city's return now found themselves cut off from the ordinary rhythms of spiritual life that gave daily existence its shape and meaning. Children could not be christened. The newlywed could not be blessed. Those who died could not be laid to rest in consecrated ground. Clergy were forbidden from performing the rites that their communities depended upon. Medieval people understood the world through their relationship to the church in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern distance. The interdict was not merely an inconvenience, it was a rupture in the fabric of daily life, a severing of the community from the sacramental order that held everything together. The faithful who had prayed for Jerusalem's restoration now had to travel outside the city's walls simply to receive communion. The church's finances suffered. The social and economic life of an already fragile community grew harder. What had been promised as a triumph had arrived wrapped in a silence that felt, to those living inside it, less like peace than like a long and indefinite penance. For the Muslim residents who had lived within Jerusalem and in the communities surrounding it, the treaty carried its own quiet weight. The agreement had preserved Muslim access to the Temple Mount, to Al-Haram al-Sharif, to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But it had done so by placing those sacred sites within a city that was now, at least in its political definition, under Christian rule. The theological importance of what had been preserved was immense. The Dome of the Rock stood over the very spot from which the prophet was believed to have been taken on the night journey, the Isra and Miraj, the miraculous ascent to heaven that stands at the center of Islamic spiritual understanding. Al-Aqsa Mosque, the farthest mosque, was named in the Quran itself. These were not simply holy buildings. They were the physical anchors of a divine history that connected the Muslim community to every prophet who had ever walked the earth, to Abraham, to David, to Solomon, to Jesus, and to Muhammad. The fact that Muslim worship at these sites continued was not, in the eyes of Islamic scholars, a sufficient answer to the fundamental problem the treaty had created. The city itself, the city that Islamic sources portrayed as the first Qibla, as the stage for the end of time, as a sacred axis linking earth to heaven, was no longer under Muslim governance. In the mosques and among the communities of the region, the sense of loss was not theoretical. It was felt as something almost physical, a wound in the spiritual geography of the world. When the news of the Treaty of Jaffa reached Pope Gregory IX in Rome, his response was immediate and unequivocal. He repudiated the agreement entirely. He condemned it as illegitimate, arranged by an excommunicated emperor without papal authorization, granting concessions to a Muslim ruler that no faithful Christian sovereign ought to have made. Gregory renewed the excommunication and went further still, proclaiming a crusade, not against the Muslims of the Holy Land, but against Frederick himself. While Frederick had been in the East, negotiating the return of Jerusalem, the Pope had used his absence to launch a military campaign against Frederick's own kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily. The armies of the papacy had crossed into imperial territory, and they were burning and pillaging as they went. What Gregory found most objectionable ran deeper than any single clause of the treaty. It was the totality of what Frederick represented, a secular emperor who acted without ecclesiastical sanction, who conducted his own foreign policy without papal blessing, who had crowned himself king of the holiest city in Christendom, in a church where no priest had lifted a hand in affirmation. Frederick had demonstrated in the most visible way imaginable that a ruler could conduct a crusade, recover Jerusalem, and govern a kingdom entirely on his own terms. To Gregory, this was not a triumph to be celebrated. It was a precedent to be feared, and a provocation that could not go unanswered. The return of Jerusalem, which might have been the moment of reconciliation between Pope and Emperor, had instead made the conflict between them deeper and more intractable than it had ever been before. On the 1st of May, 1229, Frederick II walked down to the harbour at Acre to board the ships that would carry him back to Europe. It was not a departure that history remembers kindly, or that the city of Acre marked with any ceremony of farewell. The people of Acre had long distrusted the emperor who had descended upon their port city with an excommunication hanging over his head, who had made a peace that many of them found shameful, and who had conducted himself throughout his time in the Holy Land with an imperious disregard for the customs and sensitivities of those who had to live there after he was gone. As Frederick moved through the streets toward the harbour, the butchers of the city, men whose livelihood lined the lanes nearest the waterfront, expressed their feelings in the most visceral terms available to them. They hurled offal and animal entrails at the departing emperor. Scraps of meat, waste from their trade, rained down as the most powerful monarch in the Christian world made his way to the sea. It was an act both humiliating and richly symbolic. Frederick left a city that had returned Jerusalem to Christian hands, and that hated him for how he had done it. He was, as contemporary accounts describe him, embittered, hated, cursed, and vilified. And he was also, in every political sense, in serious danger. The papal armies were already moving through his Italian territories. His kingdom was under attack. The crusade he had launched to recover Jerusalem had, in its aftermath, left him more besieged than when it began. Before he departed, Frederick had made arrangements, of a kind, for the kingdom he was leaving behind. His infant son Conrad was styled as the king, with Frederick himself serving as regent in name. His appointed representative, Richard Filangieri, was left to administer the day-to-day governance of the Crusader territories as the emperor's lieutenant. The feudal framework of the kingdom remained in place, but the local barons, men like the powerful Ibelin family, would contest these appointments almost immediately, seeing in Filangieri the extension of an imperial hand that had never truly understood or respected the constitutional traditions of the kingdom it claimed to rule. Frederick himself, sailing away from Acca towards Cyprus and then toward the Italian port of Brindisi, reflected on what had passed. He wrote afterward of the awe he had felt within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He described his conversations with Sultan Al-Kamil as courteous and intellectually rich. He declared that his crusade had proven the power of reason over the sword, that words could accomplish what armies could not. He was not entirely wrong. Jerusalem had been recovered. The terms of its return were fragile and deeply imperfect, but the city was, for the moment, in Christian hands. What Frederick could not yet fully see, sailing westward across a Mediterranean autumn, was the true cost of what he had done. The papal armies were in his kingdom. The Crusader nobility was preparing to resist his regency. The Muslim world was simmering with grievance. Frederick sailed away from a city that despised him for giving it peace, back toward a Europe where the Pope had used his absence to launch a war against his own kingdom. And the strange homecoming that awaited him would prove that the Crusade's most dangerous consequences had only just begun to unfold. Chapter 5. The Consequences That Nobody Wanted. While Frederick sailed toward the Holy Land in the summer of 1228, the world he had left behind did not wait quietly for his return. Pope Gregory IX, watching the emperor's departure with something between fury and calculation, moved swiftly and deliberately. He renewed Frederick's excommunication, declared the kingdom of Sicily a papal fief now subject to his authority, and dispatched armies southward into the territories the emperor had left unguarded. The action had a name that history would remember with a certain grim poetry: the War of the Keys. The papal forces moved in two waves, the first in the late months of 1228, the second pressing forward in the opening weeks of 1229. They were commanded by John of Brienne, a former king consort who carried with him both military experience and the authority of the Church's blessing. Senior church officials travelled alongside him: Cardinals Giovanni Colonna and Pelagius of Albano, and the papal legate Pandolf of Anagni. Together they swept into Frederick's Italian holdings with a purpose that was unmistakable. The strongholds of Suessa and Gaeta fell. A siege was laid against Capua. The imperial march of Ancona and the Duchy of Spoleto were seized and claimed as papal territory. Town by town, castle by castle, the lands that Frederick had spent years consolidating were being quietly taken from him while he negotiated in the sands of the Levant. It was a remarkable act of institutional audacity, a pope launching what amounted to a full military campaign against a reigning emperor on the justification that a man under excommunication had no right to rule. The kingdom of Sicily, with all its wealth and complexity, was being claimed by Rome, and Frederick was far away, unable to respond. Frederick returned from the Holy Land in June of 1229. He stepped ashore in Sicily to find his kingdom partially occupied, his barons divided, and his cities uncertain of where their loyalty should fall. The news of what had happened in his absence arrived with him, or perhaps ahead of him, carried by messengers whose faces told the story before their words did. His response was measured, swift, and controlled. He mobilized the loyal forces at his disposal, soldiers from Sicily and the Crusaders who had returned with him, including the disciplined ranks of the Teutonic Order. These were men who had traveled with him to the east and back, men whose loyalty had been tested and who trusted the emperor's judgment even when the church condemned it. Within weeks, the shape of the campaign in southern Italy began to reverse. The papal sieges of Capua and Sulmona were lifted. Frederick's forces pushed the papal troops back across the Volturno and Calore rivers. Campania was reclaimed as far north as the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, that grey stone landmark that had watched centuries of armies pass beneath it. By October of 1229, the active phase of the conflict had ended. Imperial control over the southern kingdom had been restored. What is notable, and what speaks to something careful in Frederick's character, is what he did not do. He did not advance into papal territories. He did not march on Rome. He stopped, consolidated, and began to reach towards negotiation. The man who had just recovered Jerusalem without drawing a sword was applying the same logic to his own doorstep, using force enough to reclaim what was his, and then offering the open hand of diplomacy rather than pressing the advantage into something larger and more dangerous. The peace that followed took shape over the course of the following year. On the 23rd of July, 1230, at a town called San Germano, the place now known as Cassino, and finalized at Ceprano a little over a month later, Frederick and the representatives of Gregory IX set their names to a formal settlement. History would call it the Treaty of San Germano. Its terms were precise and, in places, painful for both sides. Frederick's excommunication was lifted. All papal sanctions against him were cancelled. His supporters received a general amnesty, and exiles were permitted to return. Properties that had been seized from the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Roman Church were to be restored. But Frederick paid a price that touched something close to the structure of his power. He was required to renounce his traditional authority over the Sicilian Church, an extraordinary set of privileges that had allowed him to influence clerical appointments, bring clergy before secular courts, and collect taxes from ecclesiastical estates. Free ecclesiastical elections would now be guaranteed. Clergy would be exempt from secular courts, taxes, and tallage. The papal claims over certain territories, including the towns of Gaeta and Sant'Agata dei Goti, were formally recognized. The formal ceremony of reconciliation took place on the 28th of August, 1230, at Ceprano. The papal legates Thomas of Capua and Giovanni Colonna absolved the emperor before witnesses. Frederick had personally met Gregory IX at Anagni beforehand, bowing to the conditions that made peace possible. It was a settlement that reflected the exhaustion of both sides. Neither had achieved everything they wanted, but the war had ended, and for a few years at least, the two great powers of the medieval world would find ways to coexist. The peace of 1230 held, but it held the way thin ice holds, present and functional, yet never quite trustworthy underfoot. As the years of the 1230s unfolded, the relationship between Frederick and Gregory IX grew steadily more strained, moving through stages of quiet tension towards something that felt, in retrospect, inevitable. By 1235, the strain had become visible. Accusations circulated that the emperor was colluding with the Lombard League, the federation of northern Italian cities that had long resisted imperial authority, to undermine the pope's influence. Frederick, for his part, pursued his own ambitions in the north with increasing boldness. When he moved against Sardinia, an imperial fief held in trust by the papacy, and sought to secure its throne for his son Enzio, Gregory regarded it as a provocation that could not be absorbed. In March of 1239, the fragile peace collapsed entirely. Gregory renewed Frederick's excommunication with a vehemence that exceeded even the earlier condemnations. The propaganda that followed was striking in its intensity. Gregory cast Frederick not merely as a political enemy of the Church, but as something close to a spiritual monster, a forerunner of Antichrist, a man whose nature was incompatible with Christian civilization. The language escalated from institutional grievance to something that sounded almost apocalyptic. The Lombard League, those northern Italian cities that had resisted every emperor who tried to impose direct rule upon them, Milan, Venice, Verona, Padua, Brescia, Mantua, remained a persistent obstacle. Frederick spent the later years of his reign locked in a cycle of military campaigns, diplomatic maneuvering, and outright warfare against both the League and the papacy simultaneously. The consequences of the Crusade had not ended in 1230. They had only paused. Far to the east, in the city that Frederick had recovered through the quiet art of negotiation, the consequences of the Treaty of Jaffa were unfolding in their own slow and complicated way. Jerusalem had been returned to Christian administration in 1229, but it was a fragile and carefully circumscribed arrangement. The Haram al-Sharif, the sacred precinct of the Temple Mount, with its mosque and its dome, remained under a Muslim garrison and a judge. Both Christians and Muslims were permitted to visit and pray within the city. All other Muslims and Jews were required to leave. The Crusaders could not rebuild the city's defenses. For 15 years, Jerusalem functioned as a kind of enclave, Christian administered in its secular affairs, connected to the coast by a corridor that passed through Lydda and Bethlehem, its outer walls still bearing the marks of demolition that the Ayyubids had carried out before handing it over. Day-to-day authority rested with a governor appointed in the emperor's name, a bailiff who managed courts and taxes and maintained a semblance of order. The Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem held authority over the churches and clergy. A small garrison watched the walls. It was an unusual arrangement for its time, a city shared imperfectly and uneasily between faiths and political systems that rarely found such accommodations. And yet it endured year after year through the 1230s and into the 1240s, outlasting the immediate fury that had greeted its establishment. But the arrangement rested on the continued willingness of powers far larger than Jerusalem to leave it undisturbed. That willingness, as with so much else in this story, had a limit. The year 1244 arrived like the turning of a tide. The 10-year truce established by the Treaty of Jaffa had already formally expired in 1239, leaving Jerusalem's status uncertain and its defences still unrepaired. The Barons' Crusade of 1239 to 1241 had come and gone, achieving modest gains but leaving the city without the military reinforcement it needed. And to the east, forces were gathering that had nothing to do with the old negotiations between Frederick and Al-Kamil. The Khwarezmian Turks were a people displaced by catastrophe. Originating from the steppe regions of Central Asia, the lower Amu Darya basin, the area of ancient Khwarezm, they had ruled a great empire that stretched across present-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, and Iran. The Mongol advance of 1231 had shattered that empire, scattering its warriors across the Islamic world as rootless mercenary forces without a homeland. The Egyptian Sultan Al-Saleh saw in these displaced soldiers an opportunity. He recruited them, granted them passage through Ayyubid lands, and directed them toward the Crusader territories in the north. It was a calculated act of strategic ruthlessness, unleashing a force that had nothing left to lose upon a city that had been living on borrowed time. On the 15th of July, 1244, the Khwarezmians arrived before the walls of Jerusalem. The city had no rebuilt fortifications, no substantial garrison, and no relief force close enough to help. What followed was not a siege in the conventional sense. It was a catastrophe that moved with terrible speed. And when it was over, the arrangement that Frederick had made in 1229, the careful, diplomatic, much criticized agreement that had returned the holy city to Christian hands, was erased from the landscape entirely. The fall of Jerusalem in 1244 was a violence of a particular and haunting kind. The Khwarezmians overran the Armenian quarter first, cutting down its inhabitants without ceremony. The surviving Christians of the city sought refuge in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that place of ancient stone and accumulated prayer that had stood at the center of the crusading imagination for nearly 2 centuries. They were found there. Priests were beheaded. Bodies were thrown into the streets. The tombs of the Crusader kings were desecrated. When the Tower of David fell, the remaining population, some 6,000 men, women, and children, were marched out under a promise of safe passage. The promise was not kept. They were massacred on the road. Only roughly 300 managed to reach the coastal city of Jaffa alive. Jerusalem would not return to Christian hands. Not then, not in the decades that followed, not in the centuries that came after. The Crusaders who remained in the Holy Land retreated to their coastal strongholds, Acre above all, and held on for another generation, until Acre itself fell in 1291. But the holy city, the destination that had pulled so many generations of soldiers and pilgrims eastward through the dust and the heat and the sea, was gone. 3 months after the Khwarezmian sack at a place called Laforbi near Gaza, the armies of the Crusader kingdom and their Ayyubid allies from Damascus, Homs, and Kerak met the Egyptian forces reinforced by the Khwarezmian cavalry. The battle lasted 2 days and ended in a decisive Egyptian victory. The military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights suffered losses from which they would never fully recover. The loss of Jerusalem in 1244 reached the courts of Europe with the weight of a wound. In France, King Louis IX received the news during an illness so severe that those around him had already begun to prepare for his death. When he recovered, he interpreted his survival as a sign and took the cross in December of that same year, driven both by personal piety and by the desperate urgency that had arrived with the reports from the East. Louis organized what history would call the Seventh Crusade, launching it in 1248 with careful preparation and genuine conviction. Unlike Frederick's expedition, which had achieved its ends through negotiation and the diplomatic relationship with Al-Kamil, Louis returned to the older model, a military campaign aimed first at Egypt, the source of Muslim power in the region. The goal of reconquering Jerusalem was acknowledged as too uncertain for direct assault. The strategy was to strike at the root. The Seventh Crusade ended in disaster. Louis was captured. A vast ransom was paid. The army suffered enormously from disease and military reversal in the Nile Delta. The crusade that had been launched with such high purpose returned home, diminished, having achieved nothing that endured. And in this chain of events, the shape of what Frederick's crusade had truly meant becomes clearer. He had recovered Jerusalem without a great battle, through the kind of diplomatic relationship that many of his contemporaries found incomprehensible or scandalous. Jerusalem had held for 15 years under that arrangement. When it fell not to a failure of negotiation, but to a force that no treaty could have anticipated or contained. The crusades that followed, larger, more orthodox, more loudly blessed, fared worse. The quiet, disputed success of 1229 was not equalled again. Beyond the military and political consequences, there was another legacy of Frederick's reign that moved more slowly and more quietly through history, but may have travelled farther. In the court he had built, in Palermo and in the cultured centres of his kingdom, a remarkable act of intellectual transmission had been taking place for decades. Scholars gathered around Frederick who could read Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Among them was Michael Scott, a Scottish scholar of extraordinary range, mathematician, astrologer, philosopher, linguist, who had passed through Bologna and Toledo before arriving at the imperial court around 1225. Working alongside others, Scott oversaw the translation of Aristotle's major works and the commentaries of the great Islamic philosopher Ibn Rushd, known in the Latin West as Averroes, from Arabic into Latin. Texts on the soul, on causality, on the nature of being, on animals, on the heavens, the foundations of a philosophical tradition that had been preserved and elaborated in the Islamic world for centuries, were carried across the language barrier and placed in the hands of Latin-reading scholars. John of Palermo produced the first Latin version of Ptolemy's Optics and a translation of the Almagest, commissioned directly by the emperor. The algebraic work of al-Khwarizmi, the astronomical tables of al-Battani, the medical texts of Avicenna. These moved through Frederick's court into the broader intellectual circulation of medieval Europe. The questions Frederick himself posed to Islamic thinkers were philosophical in their deepest nature. The eternity of the universe, the immortality of the soul, the capacity of reason to apprehend divine truth. He corresponded with the Ayyubid ruler Al-Kamil and with the philosopher Ibn Sabin, sending what became known as the Sicilian Questions, meditations on cosmology, metaphysics, and the nature of being. The path of this knowledge did not stop at the court. Frederick had founded a university at Naples in 1224, one of the first universities established by secular rather than ecclesiastical authority in medieval Europe. Its curriculum drew upon the newly translated works of Aristotle and the commentarial tradition that had arrived through the translations at his court. The teachers who shaped its intellectual life, scholars such as Peter of Ireland, Martin of Dacia, and Petrus de Ibernia, were men formed in the cultural atmosphere that Frederick's patronage had created. Among the young men who studied at Naples was a boy of noble Neapolitan family, who would go on to become one of the most consequential thinkers of the medieval world. His name was Thomas Aquinas. Scholars who have traced the intellectual lineage believe the connection is direct and meaningful. The works of Aristotle that Aquinas would eventually synthesize with Catholic theology, the philosophical structure that became the backbone of scholastic thought, the method of reasoning that shaped European universities for centuries, entered his education through the university that Frederick had built, the translations that Frederick's court had produced, and the teachers who operated within the intellectual culture that the emperor had fostered. Frederick himself was a man whose personal relationship with Christian faith was, by most contemporary accounts, skeptical at best. He was excommunicated multiple times. Chroniclers who knew his court described a ruler who regarded religious doctrine with open curiosity rather than devout conviction, who preferred empirical inquiry to received authority, and who surrounded himself with Muslims, Jews, and Christians without apparent preference. Dante would later place him among the heretics. And yet, through the translations his court produced and the university he founded, something of his intellectual world flowed directly into the making of Thomas Aquinas. Frederick II died in December of 1250 in the castle of Fiorentino in Apulia. He was 55 years old and had spent the last years of his life in cycles of warfare, excommunication, and negotiation that showed no sign of resolution. The peace he had made with Gregory IX in 1230 had collapsed. A new pope, Innocent IV, had continued and intensified the campaign against him, calling a council at Lyon in 1245 that formally declared Frederick deposed, an act of extraordinary papal ambition that demonstrated how completely the emperor's challenge had forced the papacy to reach for its most extreme instruments. The Kingdom of Sicily, that centralized, bureaucratic, legally sophisticated state that Frederick had built, with its salaried administrators, its codified laws, its tolerance for Muslim and Jewish scholars and soldiers in royal service, would be contested after his death, eventually passing to the House of Anjou. His administrative innovations, however, did not disappear with the kingdom. The rational legal structures he had pioneered, the idea of a secular state governed by written law, and professional civil servants rather than feudal obligation and ecclesiastical supervision, would find echoes in the governance of later centuries. And the city he had recovered through a treaty that everyone condemned, the city that had been held for 15 years, and then lost to a force no negotiation could have turned aside. That city remained in the memory of the medieval world the most unexpected achievement of an unexpected man. The consequences of what Frederick had done rippled outward through the decades of his life and far beyond his death, and to understand what his crusade truly meant for medieval history, we must follow the story to its end, to the man himself in his final years, and to the strange way in which history decided to remember him. Chapter 6. The Verdict of History. By the year 1245, the empire that Frederick II had spent a lifetime assembling was beginning to show the deep cracks that no mortar of ambition could fill. Pope Innocent IV, born Sinibaldo Fieschi in the city of Genoa around 1195, was a man of remarkable legal learning, a cardinal who had risen through the careful discipline of canon law before assuming the chair of St. Peter in June of 1243. He was precisely the kind of opponent Frederick could not easily dismiss. Not a warrior, not a general, but a scholar of authority, a man who understood that power could be wielded through parchment and proclamation just as surely as through sword and siege. When Innocent convened the Council of Lyons in 1245, roughly 250 prelates gathered beneath the vaulted stone of that French city, far beyond the reach of imperial armies. It was there on the 17th of July that the council pronounced its sentence. Frederick II was excommunicated once more, and this time declared formally deposed. The papal bull carried the accusation in plain terms: perjury, disturbance of the peace, sacrilege, and the dark shadow of suspected heresy. The document went further still, branding the emperor a friend of the Sultan of Babylon, a phrase weighted with contempt in an age when alliance with Muslim rulers was considered a form of spiritual treason. The council also called for a new crusade, though it was the old struggle, the same contest dressed in fresh vestments. Frederick, for his part, refused to appear before the council at all, declaring that to stand before a pope in judgment was beneath the dignity of the empire itself. The deposition, he announced, would not stand without a bloody struggle. The propaganda war that followed the Council of Lyons was extraordinary in its ferocity. The papacy did not merely condemn Frederick. It unleashed upon him a torrent of language designed to unmake a man in the eyes of Christendom. He was called the viperous brood, the poisonous offspring of a dragon of poisonous race. He was named a son of lies, a robber, a blasphemer, a wolf in sheep's clothing. The imagery was drawn from the deepest wells of Christian apocalyptic literature. Frederick was likened to the beast of Revelation, rising out of the sea full of words of blasphemy, with the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. These were not merely insults. They were theological weapons, each accusation calibrated to strip away the sacred legitimacy that a crowned emperor required. The charge of heresy was the most dangerous of all. His enemies recalled the long memory of his dealings with Muslim rulers, the intellectual exchange at his Sicilian court, the tolerance he extended to Jewish and Muslim subjects. The Latin patriarch Gerald of Jerusalem had called him an Islamophile years before, after the Treaty of 1229. Now those old accusations returned, thickened by time and bitterness. Some went further, repeating the most corrosive rumor of all: that Frederick had privately dismissed Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad as three swindlers who had deceived the world. Whether this claim was true, fabricated, or wildly distorted from something more nuanced, it served its purpose in the propaganda of the moment. Frederick answered these charges in writing, issuing circular letters to the princes of Europe, declaring his conscience pure, his majesty uninjured, and framing the Pope's campaign as nothing more than covetousness and overreach. While the war of words raged across the courts and chanceries of Europe, the physical war in Italy ground on with exhausting consequence. Frederick's final years were marked by a series of painful military reversals that made the rhetoric of his deposition feel, to his enemies, almost prophetic. At the Battle of Parma in 1248, his forces suffered a crushing defeat that cost him more than soldiers. It cost him prestige, and in the medieval world, prestige was a currency as vital as silver. The following year, at Fossalta in 1249, came another blow, and the rhythm of imperial ambition began to falter. The Lombard rebels who had defied him for so long were proving more resilient than any fortress he had built. Yet, amid these sorrows, the building program that had defined so much of his vision continued. Castel del Monte, that extraordinary octagonal fortress in Apulia, rose between 1240 and 1250 as if the emperor were determined to leave something permanent in stone, even as his political world crumbled. It stands today, 8 towers, 8 rooms on each floor, an architecture so precise and deliberate that scholars still debate its meaning and purpose, whether it was hunting lodge, palace, or symbol of something harder to name. The state of the Hohenstaufen Empire in these late years was a study in paradox. The fiscal resources remained, the castles and monasteries and tolls endured, but the political centre was hollowing out. Rival claimants to the imperial throne had been installed by the papacy, Heinrich Rasper, William of Holland, and the loyalty of the German princes was dissolving like morning frost. The great interregnum was already casting its long shadow forward from the future. In the early days of December 1250, Frederick II withdrew to a hunting lodge called Castel Fiorentino in the southern reaches of his kingdom of Sicily, deep in the province of Apulia. He was not yet 56 years old, but the body that had carried him through decades of campaign and controversy was failing. Dysentery had taken hold, wearing him down through prolonged weeks of illness. He had, with a kind of quiet order, drafted his testament on the 7th of December, specifying that he wished to be buried in the Cathedral of Palermo. Then, on the 13th of December, the illness completed its work. He died peacefully in the lodge, reportedly clothed in the simple habit of a Cistercian monk, a detail that carries its own quiet ambiguity. A man who had clashed with the church for most of his adult life, dressed in its garments at the last. His Saracen guard, those Muslim soldiers who had accompanied him through so many years of paradox, escorted his body to Palermo, where it was laid to rest in a sarcophagus of red porphyry beneath the cathedral's ancient stone. Whether Frederick had made any effort to seek reconciliation with Rome before his death remains a question wrapped in uncertainty. Envoys had been sent, overtures had been made, but no absolution was ever granted. No papal decree arrived to lift the excommunication. The chronicles of Matthew of Paris confirm it, and the silence of the papal records confirms it again. He died as he had lived for the last years of his reign, formally excluded from the communion of the church he had once claimed to serve, carrying that weight into the stillness of the porphyry tomb. With Frederick gone, the dynasty he had built began its slow and sorrowful unraveling. His legitimate son, Conrad IV, inherited the claim to empire and held it, but only for a few short years before dying in 1254, leaving behind a young child and a fractured inheritance. Frederick's illegitimate son, Manfred, stepped into the vacancy in Sicily with the particular boldness of a man who had little patience for waiting, seizing the crown and ruling with a certain brilliance until 1266, when Charles of Anjou, brother of Louis IX of France, invited southward by a papacy determined to extinguish the Hohenstaufen line, defeated and killed him at the Battle of Benevento. That should have been the end, but the story required one final chapter, and it was written in blood. Conrad IV's young son, barely a teenager, gathered what he could of Hohenstaufen loyalty and marched south to reclaim the family's Italian and German holdings. He was captured after the Battle of Tagliacozzo in 1268, tried for treason, and beheaded in Naples. He was 16 years old. With his death, the male line of the Hohenstaufen house came to its absolute end. The great interregnum that followed, stretching from 1254 to 1273, saw imperial authority collapse into a fog of competing claims and regional fragmentation. The territories Frederick had spent his life consolidating were divided among rivals and foreign powers. The Kingdom of Sicily passed eventually to Angevin rule, though that arrangement too would fracture violently in 1282, when the uprising known as the Sicilian Vespers drove the Angevins from the island, which then passed to the Crown of Aragon. History rarely waits long before it begins to render its verdicts, and in the case of Frederick II, the first assessments came quickly, carried in the ink of medieval chroniclers who struggled to find the right measure for a figure who exceeded their ordinary categories. The phrase they reached for most often was one that had already attached itself to him in life. Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. It was not simply praise. It was a kind of awe before something that resisted easy classification. These chroniclers acknowledged his learning, his legal reforms, his cultured and multilingual court, the singular quality of his intellect. Even those who wrote with hostility found that they could not diminish him entirely. He was too large for their condemnation to fully contain. Then came Dante Alighieri, writing his Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, and his verdict was precise and merciless. In the 10th canto of the Inferno, Frederick was placed among the heretics of the 6th circle of hell, condemned alongside those who denied the immortality of the soul, the Epicureans, as Dante's age understood them. The charge was heresy, following the papal accusations that had defined his reputation. Yet even here, Dante's portrait was not entirely without dignity. The emperor was acknowledged alongside his son Manfred as an exemplar of aristocratic bearing and cultural refinement, condemned and admired in the same careful breath, which is perhaps the most honest verdict a poet ever rendered on a complicated man. Dante's hell is a place of perfect justice, but it is also a place where greatness and damnation are not mutually exclusive. And in placing Frederick there, the poet captured something that simpler histories could not. Centuries passed, and each age found in Frederick something it needed. By the 19th century, German nationalism had discovered in him a figure perfectly suited to its romantic ambitions. Historians and writers of the newly unified national movement celebrated his administrative genius, the efficiency of his court, the sweeping ambition of a ruler who had sought to hold together an empire that stretched from the Baltic to Jerusalem. He became, in their telling, a precursor to German greatness, a warrior monarch whose strength and vision were the qualities that a great nation required of its mythic past. This transformation was not simply scholarly enthusiasm, it was the work of memory, reshaped by need. Then, in 1927, a young German historian named Ernst Kantorowicz published a biography that would alter the intellectual image of Frederick II for the entire 20th century. The book, simply titled Frederick II, was written without footnotes, its prose florid and visionary. Its argument that Frederick embodied a form of sacred kingship that fused Christian theocracy with Roman law and Oriental splendor. Kantorowicz portrayed him as messianic, charismatic, a precursor to modernity who could hold Muhammad and Christ within the same imperial embrace. The book caused immediate controversy. Some scholars condemned its mythic, almost worshipful tone. Others recognized that it had broken new ground in the way biography could approach a historical figure as a cultural symbol rather than merely a sequence of events. Kantorowicz later supplied a supplemental volume of sources to answer his critics, but the image he had created lingered. The tolerant cosmopolite, the tyrant innovator, a figure standing at the crossroads of civilizations. Friedrich Nietzsche, that restless philosopher of the late 19th century, also found something in Frederick worth celebrating, though for entirely different reasons. In the pages of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche held Frederick II up as a prototype of what he called the higher type, a man who had defied the prevailing moral order of his age, who had forged his own values rather than accepting the ones handed down by the Church. Nietzsche placed him alongside Caesar and Leonardo da Vinci, figures whose fierce individualism and intellectual freedom represented for him the highest expression of the will to power. It is a striking testament to Frederick's strangeness as a historical figure that he could inspire both the romantic nationalism of the German historians and the philosophical individualism of Nietzsche, as if the man himself contained multitudes too varied to be claimed by any single interpretation. And yet, both responses pointed to something real, the sense that Frederick had operated according to a logic that was fundamentally his own, that he had refused the categories his age offered him and had tried to build something new, something that his contemporaries found deeply unsettling, and that later centuries found endlessly fascinating. Modern scholarship of the 20th and 21st centuries has approached him with considerably more caution, setting aside both the romantic myth and the papal condemnation in favor of a more measured account. Historians now generally describe him as a pragmatic, skeptical Christian, a ruler whose tolerance toward Jews and Muslims in Sicily was a tool of governance rather than evidence of secret conversion, and whose true inner beliefs remain, finally, indeterminate, a silence at the center of all the noise his life produced. What did Frederick's crusade finally tell the world about the relationship between faith and political power in the medieval age? Historians have thought carefully about this question, and their answer tends to be the same. The Sixth Crusade demonstrated that the papacy's monopoly over holy war was not absolute. By recovering Jerusalem through negotiation, through the Treaty of Jaffa of 1229, an agreement that secured Christian access to the Holy City, Bethlehem and Nazareth, without a single major battle, Frederick proved that secular authority could set its own agenda and succeed where papal blessing was absent. The papacy responded to this success with excommunication, which is perhaps the most telling fact of all. The legitimacy of a crusade, it turned out, depended not merely on what was achieved, but on who authorized the achieving. And yet the cities Frederick recovered proved fragile in the longer view. Jerusalem was seized by the Khwarezmian forces in 1244, and from there it passed into the hands of the Mamluk Sultanate, beyond the reach of Christian arms for centuries. Bethlehem saw its walls demolished by the Mamluks in 1263. Nazareth fell under Mamluk and then Ottoman administration. The sites that Frederick had placed in Christian hands through the patience of diplomacy became part of the long history of the Eastern Mediterranean that no single treaty could permanently settle. Today, these places carry the weight of all those centuries. Jerusalem divided, contested, and declared a capital in ways the international community does not universally accept. Bethlehem administered by the Palestinian Authority. Nazareth, a predominantly Arab Christian city within the State of Israel. The echo of 1229 is very long. Beyond the questions of crusade and faith, the administrative legacy Frederick left in his Kingdom of Sicily continued to cast a long shadow over the history of the European state. His constitutions of Melfi, issued in 1231 under the name Liber Augustalis, had laid out a comprehensive legal code of remarkable ambition, replacing the patchwork of Norman feudal custom with a uniform set of statutes administered by lay jurists trained in Roman law, linking the emperor directly to provincial officials through a hierarchical chain of command. This was not merely legal housekeeping. It was a vision of governance in which sovereign authority resided in the monarch rather than in the competing claims of barons, bishops, and local custom. It anticipated in outline the centralized state that later centuries would build in earnest. The court that Frederick gathered around him in Sicily and Apulia also transmitted something more intangible, a tradition of intellectual translation and exchange that helped carry Greek, Arabic, and Latin learning into the broader stream of European thought. The translations produced under his patronage moved key texts beyond the reach of clergy and university scholars alone, fostering a wider lay engagement with philosophy and natural knowledge. Later rulers and later scholars would build upon this foundation, and the thread runs forward through humanism and the Renaissance into the intellectual culture of early modern Europe. His court's legacy was not the dramatic legacy of military conquest. It was quieter, slower, and perhaps more durable. It was the legacy of ideas passed from hand to hand across languages and centuries, accumulating weight with each translation, each copy, each reader who encountered them in a new vernacular and found in them something that spoke to the age they lived in. Why does Frederick II resist the clear, heroic narrative that history gave to Richard the Lionheart, or to other crusaders whose names became emblems of Christian valor? The question carries its own answer within it. Richard fought great battles. His crusade had the drama of siege and cavalry charge, the personal combat of a warrior king, the vivid theatre of a struggle that looked, from a distance, like the simplest kind of story. Christian soldier against Muslim army, swords meeting beneath an open sky. Frederick achieved something Richard could not. He recovered Jerusalem, but he did it through conversation, through the careful architecture of a diplomatic agreement, through patience rather than violence. And because he was excommunicated, because he had spent years alienating the institutional church, because his court was full of Muslim scholars and Jewish physicians and Arabic poetry, the clean, heroic frame was never available to him. The papacy had already decided what he was, and the propaganda it produced was thorough and lasting. He became the wonder of the world and also the beast of Revelation. He became a heretic in Dante's Hell and a higher type in Nietzsche's philosophy. He became a German national icon and a cautionary tale about imperial overreach. He became to Islamic historians both a courteous friend and a shameful betrayer, depending on which court was writing. He has never settled into a single story because he never was a single story. He was an emperor who recovered Jerusalem without a battle and was condemned by both sides for doing it. A ruler whose administrative genius outlasted his dynasty. A man whose inner faith remains finally unknowable behind the noise of 6 centuries of argument. And so, the story of Frederick II, the excommunicated emperor who recovered Jerusalem without a battle and was condemned by both sides for doing it, settles not into resolution, but into the long, slow echo of questions that the medieval world asked and could not answer. Questions that in many ways we are still asking now.